Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really pivotal, yet often misunderstood, period in American history, Reconstruction.
Yeah, that time right after the Civil War.
Exactly. The nation was grappling with these huge challenges. How would the South actually rebuild after all that devastation? What was the place for formerly enslaved African Americans in this new society?
And the big one, really, who was going to control this whole process of putting the country back together? Was it the southern states, the president, or Congress?
Right. So we're diving into our source, 21 Reconstruction, which really lays out these competing visions and the, let's say, hard realities of the time.
Mm-hmm. And our mission here is to get beyond just listing facts. You want to pull out the crucial developments, understand the real turning points, and maybe offer some needed context to this, well, very complex chapter.
Okay, so 21 Reconstruction starts by outlining these four central questions that really define the whole era. First, you've got the massive task of physically and economically rebuilding the South.
After the war and, crucially, the end of slavery. That changed everything.
Absolutely.
All right.
Second, and this is huge, what was the status, the condition of millions of formerly enslaved people?
A fundamental question about freedom itself.
Then third, the practical politics of it.
Mm-hmm.
How do the southern states actually get reintegrated back into the Union?
What are the terms? What hoops do they have to jump through?
And finally, kind of underlying it all, this basic power struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Who's really in charge of shaping this new post-war America?
And you know what's interesting is how tangled up these questions are. You can't really talk about rebuilding the Southern economy without dealing with the new labor reality that completely changed social order
Right.
and the terms for rejoining the Union. Well, those are always going to depend on who held the political power to actually set those terms.
Makes sense. So one of the very first issues that popped up was, what do we do with the Confederate leaders? People like Jefferson Davis, they were imprisoned.
Yeah, for a couple of years, some of them.
But then, in a move that really set the stage for a lot of conflict later, President Andrew Johnson issued this blanket pardon, December 1868, basically forgiving nearly all the Confederate leaders.
Now, if we kind of unpack that a bit, Johnson's pardons weren't just about, forgiveness. They really reflected his view, a more lenient approach towards the South.
Okay.
Probably driven by wanting quick reconciliation, maybe also wanting to curb the power of the Republicans in Congress. But this decision, it had real long-term effects. It essentially let a lot of the pre-war Southern elite slide back into positions of influence.
And as you mentioned, Congress wasn't thrilled. Many of those former Confederate officials still face civil disabilities. They couldn't hold office for years afterward.
A real point of friction there.
And speaking of fundamental changes, we absolutely have to talk about the 13th Amendment, ratified December 1865.
A watershed moment, no question.
It officially abolished slavery and involuntary servitude across the whole country. Well, except as punishment for a crime.
Mm-hmm.
And crucially, it gave Congress the power to enforce it with legislation.
Yeah, that enforcement clause is key. This amendment, it's really the foundation Reconstruction was supposed to be built on. It wasn't just ending a horrific labor system. It fundamentally shifted power dynamics.
How so?
Well, it empowered the federal government in a new way regarding individual liberty. But that power, the power Congress got to enforce it, that became a major battleground as things unfolded.
21 Reconstruction paints a really stark picture of the South after the war. Utter devastation. Cities like Richmond, Charleston, Atlanta, just heavily damaged, some destroyed.
Yeah, the physical destruction was immense.
And the economy, in ruins. Banks collapsed, factories closed, transportation, railroads, bridges wrecked.
Even agriculture, the absolute core of the Southern economy, was in tatters. Fields overgrown with weeds, livestock gone. Recovery was incredibly slow.
It's hard to even imagine the scale of it, right?
Almost impossible. And it wasn't just buildings. The whole economic and social structure was torn apart. This even hit the planter aristocracy hard.
How did it affect them specifically?
Well, their main source of wealth, enslaved people, just vanished. Poof. Their grand mansions were often damaged. This loss of their traditional power base, that's really key to understanding why they pushed back so hard against Reconstruction later.
Okay, so into this chaos, Congress creates the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865,
Mm-hmm.
headed by General Oliver O. Howard. This was a pretty ambitious project.
Extremely ambitious. It was designed to help those formerly enslaved people who were facing freedom with basically nothing, unskilled, uneducated, impoverished.
What did it actually do?
Well, a whole range of things. Immediate relief, like food, clothing, medicine, but also a huge focus on education. They helped teach something like 200,000 Black individuals to read,
Wow.
which is incredible. That desire for knowledge after being denied it for so long, it's really powerful, speaks volumes about their aspirations.
The Bureau also tried to mediate labor contracts between Black workers and white landowners.
Yeah, trying to navigate that new reality.
And famously, it was authorized to distribute 40 acres in a mule land, confiscated from Confederates to formerly enslaved families. But, as the source notes, that didn't really happen consistently, did it?
No, it was very inconsistent, often sabotaged, actually. And in some cases, Bureau agents even ended up facilitating labor contracts that weren't much better than slavery, really exploitative terms.
But kind of contradictory in practice.
Absolutely. It shows the huge challenges the Bureau faced. Its goal was uplift, empowerment, but it was operating in a deeply racist society, facing constant obstruction.
And violence, too, right?
Oh, definitely. Violence against Bureau agents, violence against African Americans. It showed the fierce resistance to any real change in the racial order. And President Johnson, he was consistently against the Bureau, which eventually led to its end in 1872, a huge blow to its potential long-term impact.
Which brings us right to presidential Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson. He's such a complex figure.
Isn't he just champion of poor whites in Tennessee, but also a slave owner himself, yet crucially loyal to the Union during the war?
So when he takes over after Lincoln's assassination, you see this fundamental clash of visions for what comes next. Lincoln had his 10% plan back in 1863.
Right, which was seen as pretty lenient.
How so?
Well, it only required 10% of the 1860 voters in a southern state to swear allegiance to the Union for that state to start the process of coming back in. Many Republicans in Congress thought that was way too soft.
Too easy on the former rebel.
Exactly. They worried the old planter class would just waltz back into power and maybe even try to undermine abolition.
So Congress pushed back with the Wade-Davis bill in '64.
Right, which upped the requirement significantly, 50%. A majority had to take the oath, plus stronger guarantees for protecting emancipation.
But Lincoln pocket vetoed it.
He did, refused to sign it before Congress adjourned, so they couldn't override. It just highlighted that growing tension between the president and Congress.
And within the Republican Party, you had these different groups, right?
Yeah, the moderates who wanted the South back in fairly quickly, but on Congress's terms, not the president's, and then the radicals.
What did the radicals want?
They pushed for a much deeper transformation of the South. Social, economic upheaval, really strong federal protection for Black citizens' rights. A much more fundamental change.
So Johnson steps in. He shared Lincoln's view that the states never really left the Union legally.
Right, so he acted fast while Congress was out of session, recognized some of those 10% governments Lincoln had set up, and then May 1865, he issues his own Reconstruction Proclamation.
What did his plan involve?
Well, it did disenfranchise some top Confederates, especially the wealthy ones, but it also offered broad amnesty through pardons, lots of pardons, and it called for state conventions in the South.
With requirements.
Yes. They had to repeal secession ordinances, repudiate Confederate debts, meaning the Confederacy's war debts wouldn't be paid, and sort of grudgingly ratify the 13th Amendment.
And the result of Johnson's approach.
Exactly what many Republicans feared. The old planter elite started showing up again, getting back into positions of power, organizing state governments, and this just caused widespread outrage in the North.
Which leads directly to the Black Codes.
Directly. This outrage fueled the backlash, and you see these southern states enacting these discriminatory laws almost immediately after the war. Their main goal, regulate Black life, essentially.
How? What did they do?
Well, they aimed to ensure a cheap labor supply, basically trying to restore the pre-emancipation racial hierarchy, just without the name slavery.
So what kind of restrictions are we talking about?
Really restrictive. Strict labor contracts, severe penalties if Black workers tried to leave a job, limited rights overall. Okay, freedom in marriage might be recognized, but...
What?
But Black people were usually denied the right to serve on juries, couldn't testify against whites in court, in some places couldn't even own land, and definitely couldn't vote.
And the vagrancy laws.
Oh, those were particularly nasty. They allowed officials to arrest Black people deemed idle or unemployed, often on really flimsy grounds, and force them into labor, sometimes in chain gangs.
So forced labor under another name.
Pretty much. And combine that with the rise of sharecropping.
Explain sharecropping quickly.
Sure, black families would farm land owned by white landowners, getting a share of the crop as payment. But they often had to buy supplies on credit from the owner at high interest rates, falling deeper and deeper into debt. It created this cycle of dependence, debt peonage.
Like slavery, but with debt instead of chains.
In many ways, yes. It's no wonder these black codes just ignited fury in the North, gave congressional Republicans all the ammunition they needed to say, okay, we need to take control of this Reconstruction process.
And that anger leads straight into congressional Reconstruction and this major clash with President Johnson. The fact that former Confederate bigwigs were getting elected to state delegations in late '65.
Yeah, that sent alarm bells ringing loud and clear for Republicans in Congress.
So they just refused to seat them.
Right.
When Congress came back in December '65, they basically said, nope, you Southern Democrats are not coming in.
Exactly. They were genuinely afraid of losing their political power, seeing everything they'd achieved during the war potentially dismantled.
And the political math was part of it too, wasn't it?
Absolutely crucial. Republicans worried that, with slavery abolished, the South would actually gain more representation in Congress because the black population would now be fully counted even though they couldn't vote in most places.
So the fear was the South could regain control.
Potentially, yeah. Control of Congress, maybe even the presidency, and roll back Republican policies. So when Johnson declared the Union restored in December '65, it just poured gasoline on the fire, solidified Republican determination to take charge.
Then we see these major legislative fights. Johnson vetoes the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau.
But Congress overrides it. They're getting more unified against him now.
Then the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 aimed to grant citizenship to black Americans, take down the black codes. Johnson vetoes that too.
And Congress overrides that veto as well. A huge statement. These overrides showed Congress was absolutely determined to set the terms.
Which sets the stage for the 14th Amendment, proposed June 1866.
Right. This was the Republicans trying to lock the principles of the Civil Rights Bill into the Constitution itself, make it much harder to undo.
What were the key parts of the 14th?
Okay, first, citizenship for everyone born or naturalized in the U.S., though it initially excluded Native Americans on reservations. Second, it didn't explicitly guarantee black men the vote, but it did say a state's representation in Congress would be reduced if it denied suffrage to any adult male citizens.
Kind of an incentive or a penalty.
Exactly. Third, it disqualified many former Confederate officials from holding office again. And fourth, it guaranteed the federal debt but repudiated all Confederate debt.
And Johnson's reaction?
Fiercely opposed. He actively campaigned against it, urged Southern states to reject it, and initially all of them did except Tennessee.
But then came the 1866 midterm elections.
Huge Republican landslide gave the radicals and moderates a veto-proof majority in Congress. That really paved the way for a much more forceful approach. Military Reconstruction.
Okay, military Reconstruction. The act passed March Deg 1867. What did it do?
It basically threw out the Southern state governments Johnson had approved, divided the South into 5 military districts.
Governed by the Army.
Yes, each under a Union general, with federal troops enforcing the law. The act also took voting rights away from many former Confederates. And crucially, for a state to get back into the Union, it now had to ratify the 14th Amendment and guarantee black male suffrage in its new state constitution.
A much higher bar.
Much higher. But it's important, as you said, to remember what it didn't do. No widespread land redistribution for the formerly enslaved. Federal funding for black education was still pretty limited.
So still some limits to how radical it was.
Definitely. And while it did lead to the 15th Amendment in 1870.
Which explicitly gave black men the right to vote.
Yes, but even that had loopholes. Big ones.
Like what?
Well, it didn't mention the right to hold office. It didn't set uniform voting rules, so states could get creative.
Ah, so that's where things like poll taxes and literacy tests came in.
Exactly. Poll taxes paying a fee to vote, literacy tests often administered unfairly to disqualify black voters, grandfather clauses.
Which basically exempted white voters whose ancestors could vote before the Civil War.
Right. Plus, gerrymandering, manipulating district lines, and just outright intimidation and violence, including lynching.
And women were excluded too.
Yes, causing a major split in the women's suffrage movement. And tragically, many poor white men were also disenfranchised by some of these tactics.
So the end result, despite these amendments,
Democratic dominance returned to the South, the promise of full black suffrage, delayed for nearly 100 years until the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
and there was that Civil Rights Act of 1875 too.
Right, aimed at banning discrimination in public places like hotels, theaters, and on juries. but it really lacked teeth. No strong enforcement. And as our source points out, it was basically 90 years before similar federal laws were passed and actually
But
enforced.
by 1870, all the former Confederate states are technically back in the Union. They'd ratified the 14th and 15th Amendments, at least on paper.
Right, and as these new state governments, often called radical regimes, seemed to be established, the federal troops started pulling out.
But that stability was fragile.
Extremely fragile. White supremacist groups and the Democratic Party worked systematically to regain control, and by 1876, they had largely succeeded across the South.
What caused Reconstruction to finally end?
Several things kind of converged. In the North, people's attention started shifting. Economic worries grew after the Panic of 1873, a major depression. Political will started to fade.
And then the big moment, the Compromise of 1877.
Exactly. The presidential election of 1876 was disputed. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, was eventually declared the winner. But the deal, the compromise, was that in return for Democrats accepting Hayes, the Republicans agreed to pull the last remaining federal troops out of the South.
And that was basically it for Reconstruction.
That effectively marked the formal end. It signaled the federal government was no longer going to actively intervene to protect black rights in the South.
You also mentioned a Supreme Court case, Ex parte Milligan.
Yeah, from 1866. It wasn't directly about Reconstruction policy, but it ruled that military courts couldn't try civilians where civilian courts were open and functioning. While the court didn't challenge military Reconstruction head-on at the time, the ruling kind of hung there, implicitly questioning the long-term legality of military rule.
And this period also saw a shift in power between branches of government.
Right. The presidency was weakened, partly due to the conflict with Johnson and his impeachment. Congress became more dominant, setting the stage for the Gilded Age that followed.
Let's look closer at that radical Reconstruction period in the South itself. The source points out a kind of irony, right? About suffrage.
Yeah, while Congress was demanding black male suffrage in the South, many northern states still hadn't granted it to their own black populations. A bit hypocritical.
But despite that, there were real gains for African Americans in the South, at least for a time.
Absolutely. Significant, though temporary, gains in political participation. Black men became a majority of voters in some states for a while. They served in state legislatures, even in the U.S. Congress. Figures like Senators Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce from Mississippi.
Important progress, even if short-lived.
Definitely. But it was also a time of intense political fighting and accusations of corruption. You hear the terms scalawags and carpetbaggers.
Right. Scalawags were Southern white Republicans. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who came south.
And they were often painted as corrupt opportunists by Southern Democrats. While some corruption certainly existed, it was common everywhere. Then these groups were genuinely trying to build a different kind of South, a more inclusive one.
And did Reconstruction governments achieve anything positive?
Yes, definitely. Despite the turmoil, they did achieve some lasting things. Established public school systems in many southern states, often for the first time for both races. Improved tax systems, invested in infrastructure, expanded some rights for women, like property rights in certain states, made political representation fairer in some cases.
But then there's the dark side, the Ku Klux Klan.
A deeply sinister force. Our source correctly identifies them as basically the terror wing of the Democratic Party in the South.
They're cool.
To violently overthrow those Reconstruction governments and put white supremacy back in charge. They hated seeing black legislators and their white Republican allies in power. Founded in Tennessee, 1866. Made up of white men from all social classes. They used brutal violence, intimidation, whippings, murder against black and white Republicans.
To stop them from organizing, from voting.
Exactly. To create fear, suppress the Republican vote, and restore white control. And tragically, they were often very effective.
Did the federal government try to stop them?
Yes, Congress passed the Force Acts in 1870 and 71, also called the Enforcement Acts, or the KKK Act. These gave the federal government power to intervene, protect civil rights, even use troops against terrorist groups like the Klan.
Did they work?
They had some success, temporarily weakening the Klan in some areas, but the federal commitment wavered, enforcement was inconsistent, and many provisions were later struck down or repealed. The violence ultimately continued.
And the conflict between Congress and Johnson just kept escalating, leading to his impeachment.
It really came to a head. Radical Republicans were fed up with what they saw as Johnson deliberately blocking Reconstruction. So they passed the Tenure of Office Act in 1867.
What was that about?
It was designed specifically to stop the president from firing cabinet members without Senate approval. They wanted to protect Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who sided with the radicals.
And Johnson challenged it.
He saw it as unconstitutional, an attack on his power. So he deliberately fired Stanton anyway, basically daring Congress to react.
And they did. The House impeached him.
Charged him with high crimes and misdemeanors, mainly for violating the Tenure of Office Act.
But the Senate didn't convict him.
Nope. The trial was incredibly dramatic, March to May 1868. He was acquitted by just one single vote.
Close call.
Very. Removing him might have set a tricky precedent about presidential power. But his acquittal didn't end the conflict. His opposition continued to hinder Reconstruction and deepen the political divides.
So after Reconstruction formally ends, we see the rise of the Solid South.
Yeah, basically a century of the South being dominated almost entirely by white supremacist Democrats. The Republican Party just vanished as a real force there.
And the remaining Republican state governments collapsed.
One by one, it left this lasting legacy of resentment, discrimination. It took generations to even start chipping away at it.
Who were the redeemers who took over?
They were a coalition, really. Pre-war Democrats, some former Whigs who had opposed secession but were still conservative, Confederate veterans. Their main goal was restoring white control and shrinking government, cutting taxes and services.
Which impacted who?
Often hit black communities and poor white communities the hardest, exacerbated inequality.
Okay, quick detour the source mentions. The purchase of Alaska in 1867.
Right. Amid all this domestic turmoil, the U.S. expanded. Russia wanted to sell Alaska. It was remote, hard to manage. They feared the British might just take it.
And the fur trade was declining.
Exactly. So they offered it to the U.S., their preferred buyer. Secretary of State William Seward jumped on it. $7.2 million.
Seward's folly, they called it.
Yeah, initially controversial, but Seward saw strategic value, wanted good relations with Russia, and figured there might be resources. Turned out he was right. Furs, fish, later gold, and much later oil.
Okay, back to the aftermath of Reconstruction. Tragically, this post-Reconstruction era saw civil rights just systematically dismantled.
It's a really grim period. The White South basically ignored the spirit and often the actual text of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Sharecropping, those crop-lend laws, trapped black families in economic dependence.
And the courts didn't help.
The Supreme Court actually made things worse in some key cases. The slaughterhouse cases in 73, the civil rights cases in 83, they seriously weakened the 14th Amendment's protections. Essentially said the amendment mostly protected rights related to federal citizenship, not state citizenship, and that it only applied to state actions, not discrimination by private individuals. That basically gutted the Civil Rights Act of 1875.
Which opened the door for
wholesale disenfranchisement starting around 1890. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, gerrymandering, all designed to stop black men from voting.
And then came Jim Crow laws.
Right. In the 1890s, state and local laws mandating segregation in basically all public facilities, schools, transportation, hospitals, cemeteries, everything.
Enforced by law and by terror.
Lynchings.
Became horrifyingly common, a tool of intimidation peaking in the 1890s. Brave people like Ida B. Wells Barnett risked everything to launch anti-lynching campaigns and expose the horror.
Within the black community, there were different ideas about how to respond, right? Booker T. Washington
advocated for focusing on economic self-help, industrial education, vocational training. His Atlanta Compromise speech seemed to accept segregation for the time being, urging accommodation, though privately he did work against Jim Crow. And W.E.B. Du Bois had a different view.
Very different. Du Bois vehemently rejected accommodation. He demanded immediate political and social equality, full civil rights. He helped start the Niagara Movement, which led to the founding of the NAACP in 1909-1910.
The NAACP focusing on fighting through the courts.
Exactly, using legal challenges to fight segregation and disenfranchisement.
And then the Supreme Court decision that really cemented segregation.
Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. A devastating ruling. It upheld the idea of separate but equal, making segregation the law of the land for decades. It starkly showed how badly Reconstruction had failed to secure real equality.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear Reconstruction was this period of, well, immense promise, but ultimately deep disappointment.
Absolutely. You had these transformative amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th, establishing fundamental rights on paper. But the lack of consistent federal will to enforce them, followed by that wave of discrimination, violence, court decisions, it ruled back so much of the progress.
A really complex and ultimately tragic legacy.
It really is. And what's undeniable is that the unresolved issues, the failures of Reconstruction, they cast this incredibly long shadow over American history. The fight for genuine equality, for justice, for all citizens, it didn't end in 1877. It continued for generations, and in many ways, it still shapes our national conversations today.
About race, democracy, what citizenship even means.
Precisely.
A sobering but absolutely essential chapter for us to understand. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Reconstruction. We'll leave you with this final thought. Take a moment to reflect on how the echoes of Reconstruction, its successes, but maybe more importantly, its failures still resonate in our society today. How does that pivotal era inform our understanding of the ongoing struggle for a truly more just and equitable nation for everyone?